Welcome to the deep dive. If you're tracking foreign information manipulation and interference FIMI tactics right now, well, you've probably noticed a distinct and frankly deeply cynical tactical shift coming from the pro-Kremlin ecosystem. We're not talking about the usual stuff like election meddling here. We're really dissecting the weaponization of climate change itself, our mission today. To understand exactly how Moscow took the European Green Deal, a huge piece of economic policy, and turned it into, well, strategic ammunition in the hybrid war against the West. It's quite a calculated pivot, and we need to understand the source material that explains the why behind it.
Yeah, and what's immediately striking is the hypocrisy. It's massive. The Kremlin and its affiliated disinformation channels, they typically treat climate change with just outright disinterest or often, open disdain. Historically, climate policy was just seen as some distant Western preoccupation, not really a focus for their propaganda machine.
Right. So why the sudden, intense interest in EU green policy?
The sources make the connection crystal clear. This strategic pivot, it wasn't arbitrary. It seems to have been triggered by a very specific event, the adoption of the EU's 18th sanctions package.
Ah, okay.
Once those sanctions really started to bite, the Green Deal wasn't just abstract environmental policy anymore.
Yes.
It became a direct, almost existential economic threat.
And that seems to be the core motivation threaded throughout the source material we're looking at.
Yeah.
The EU's decarbonization push directly undercuts Russia's economic lifeline.
Exactly.
That whole economy is based on fossil fuel extraction and export. That's what funds the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
So if Europe actually succeeds in this transition,
Russia loses its primary strategic leverage and its main financial flow. It's that simple.
okay, let's unpack the tactics they're using on the ground then. We're seeing what analysts call carbon-based disinformation deployed right inside the EU. Instead of attacking the idea of climate change itself, they're attacking the implementation. What specific targeted narratives are being pushed to undermine the green agenda from within?
They really focus on the pain points. The persistent narrative is pretty simple. Green energy is an expensive, unreliable, costly fraud. Renewable energy is a failure. And the EU's policies are just short-sighted and damaging.
Standard stuff, almost.
Sort of, but they don't just stop at generalized criticism. They make it local, highly emotional.
How so? Give us an example.
Well, think about the specific domestic examples we've seen recently. In Poland, for instance, there was this really concerted push claiming the EU's Green Deal was fundamentally killing Polish farmers and industry, suggesting it was undermining the very foundations of the national economy. That's a very specific, deeply cynical target, leveraging genuine concerns about agricultural competitiveness.
Exactly. And it's not just farmers, is it? We saw similar narratives targeting heavy industry, too.
Right. We saw one outlet claiming that European industry is paralyzed because of crippling high energy prices.
And who do they blame?
Oh, they assigned the blame specifically and solely to the, quote, self-destructive policies of Brussels and Berlin. Classic deflection.
Okay, here's where the methodology gets particularly insightful, I think. These aren't really attempts at genuine policy critique, are they? They seem specifically designed to be emotionally resonant.
Completely.
Framing EU climate measures as these elite-driven schemes, policies imposed by distant, uncaring bureaucrats that inherently harm ordinary citizens, local workers.
That narrative framing is absolutely key. It's a classic FIMI tactic, really, designed to fracture societal consensus.
Makes sense.
If you can convince a population that their national interests, like farming or industry jobs, are being sacrificed for some abstract goal pushed by, say, coastal elites in a far-off capital city, well, you generate immediate distrust. Distrust in the government, distrust in the institutions implementing the policy.
So it's about leveraging and just widening existing political friction points.
Precisely. What's fascinating, of course, is that the factual reality stands in pretty sharp contrast.
How so?
Well, if we connect this back to the bigger picture. Since 1990, the EU has actually proven that economic growth and sustainability are not mutually exclusive. Emissions have decreased significantly while the economy has expanded.
Right. The data shows that.
Yeah. The green transition, arguably, guarantees future economic growth in new sectors, like renewable technology, whereas reliance on Russian gas, well, that guarantees dependency and funding for an adversarial regime.
That distinction between the narrative of domestic fracturing and the reality of securing future growth, that takes us nicely to their external strategy. If they're sowing distrust inside Europe by attacking farmers and industry, where do they take that narrative abroad? How are these same claims used to undermine the EU's credibility globally, particularly with partners in the global south?
They essentially push the idea that the EU is a hypocrite, not a leader. The main narrative here is what they call green protectionism.
Green protectionism.
No. This claims that the entire EU green agenda is simply a tool intended to slow economic growth and eliminate competitors, specifically in the global south. It aims to reframe the EU's climate leadership as just, self-serving trade dominance.
Do we have concrete examples of how they frame that?
Oh, definitely. The sources show disinformation outlets pushing claims that European countries are using environmental issues to unfairly block imports.
Right.
We saw specific accusations leveled at France, alleging they were using these green protectionism measures to block agricultural imports from Latin America. The implication being this only benefits European producers.
So it sows suspicion exactly where the EU needs cooperation the most. On climate, on trade.
Exactly. It's designed to drive a wedge.
So what does this mean for countries hearing these messages? It raises an important question. We know the EU has complex regulations like the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, which is supposed to level the playing field on carbon costs. How does the EU actually address these concerns in reality compared to the sort of simplistic, hostile narrative being pushed by the FIMI machine?
Well, the FIMI claims are effective because they cleverly isolate the regulatory stick, right? But they completely ignore the financial carrot. They ignore the reality that the EU consistently links these new climate regulations with pretty substantial financial and technical support for partner countries.
Okay, so take CBAM, which you mentioned gets targeted. How does that work in practice versus the disinformation?
Right. CBAM imposes a carbon price on certain imports to prevent carbon leakage companies moving production just to avoid carbon costs. But crucially, the mechanism includes provisions that actually consider local climate measures already in place in the exporting country.
So it's not a blunt instrument.
Not at all. And the policy is really designed to incentivize and, frankly, help countries transition their economies toward low-carbon industries to make them future-proof, competitively speaking.
And beyond specific regulations like CBAM, what about the overall scope of the support? If the disinformation goal is to make the EU look purely selfish, the actual financial commitment must paint a different picture.
Right. It absolutely does. I mean, the EU is the world's biggest provider of climate finance. You have the $300 billion Global Gateway Initiative.
The infrastructure plan.
Yeah, and it's explicitly focused on funding green energy transition and related infrastructure, including heavily in the global south. That level of financial output is pretty hard to square with the narrative that the EU is purely interested in slowing development or just achieving green protectionism.
It undermines their whole cynical message.
It really does.
Okay, let's pivot back then to the genesis of this entire strategy, that desperate desire to protect Russia's core energy sector and, crucially, to invalidate the Western sanctions regime. This really feels like the heart of the matter.
It absolutely is. All this noise about green tyranny or climate fraud, it's really just cover fire for deep economic panic in Moscow.
How do the narratives attacking sanctions work?
They seem to operate on two levels. First, they claim the sanctions are just a total failure, that they haven't really hurt the Russian economy, which is, debatable at best.
And the second level?
Second, and this is more targeted at European audiences, they claim Europe is basically committing economic suicide by cutting off Russian energy.
Right, I remember hearing that phrase a lot.
They push the idea that this severance is leading to production moving abroad, massive job losses, economic collapse across the continent. It's pure fear-mongering, designed to create political pressure to reverse the sanctions.
It reminds me of that specific, almost snarky propaganda they pushed out near the end of 2022, right when energy prices were spiking. Do you recall those online ads?
Vaguely. Which ones?
The ones claiming Europe's rejection of Russian oil and gas would trigger a new ice age on the continent. The visual was, well, absurd. Freezing Europeans apparently forced to flock to Russia, not exactly known for its balmy winters where they could supposedly still afford heating.
Oh, right. Yes, I remember those now. They really went there, didn't they?
They did.
It was clearly intended to mock European resilience, wasn't it? And reinforce that core message. Dependency on Moscow equals stability. Independence is just catastrophic foolishness.
No, the crucial context they're trying to bury
is that phasing out Russian energy was a strategy of self-protection. It had to be done. Russia repeatedly proved itself an utterly unreliable energy supplier. They used gas cutoffs as a geopolitical weapon time and time again, notably in 2006, and then dramatically again in 2022.
So the decision wasn't suicide.
Not at all. The The decision to accelerate renewables and diversify supply was a rational defensive step. It was about insulating the EU from future energy coercion. Full stop.
Which brings us neatly back to summarizing this cynicism. When Moscow screams about green tyranny or climate fraud or the supposed collapse of European industry, they're not engaging in a genuine policy debate about carbon taxes or industrial transition paths.
Yeah, not even close.
They are weaponizing disinformation simply to protect an oil and gas empire, an empire that sustains their war machine. It's an expensive full-spectrum attempt at pure economic self-preservation.
And that strategic conclusion, I think, is the key takeaway here for listeners. The sheer volume, the intensity of this FIMI attack on the Green Deal, that's probably the best possible evidence that the policy is actually working.
How so?
It proves the Green Deal poses a significant, tangible threat to Russia's revenues and its strategic leverage over Europe. If it wasn't a threat, why spend so much effort attacking it?
That's a powerful point.
This aggressive disinformation campaign should almost be interpreted as a green light. Proof that the path toward energy independence and the green transition is the correct one, and it needs to be doubled down upon, not abandoned because of this pressure.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you, the listener, to carry with you. The fundamental goal of all this disinformation seems to be reframing Europe as strategically dependent on Russia's energy, portraying its own necessary transition as a failure. So when you next encounter narratives about the supposed crippling cost of green energy, or the alleged paralysis of European industry narratives focusing on internal failure rather than the external threat that prompted the shift, just pause for a second. Consider whether you are hearing a genuine fact-based economic critique, or maybe just the frantic sound of a desperate oil empire trying desperately to keep its main funding stream alive. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the source material.